Welcome, firefighters. I've missed you. I hope you had a lovely and reflective Thanksgiving holiday and are staying healthy. As we wrap up another very peculiar, complicated year, for those of you joining us for the first time, welcome to the Fire Drill Fridays family, where we're building community, learning about the climate crisis, and taking action to stop it. Each of you can help our movement grow by sharing today's show for your friends and colleagues so they can join the movement. And so I want you to take a moment now and hit the share button. The more people who understand the gravity of the climate crisis and are willing to act, the more chance we have to succeed in minimizing it, okay? November was a busy month for the climate community, with many of us focused on the COP26 United Nations Climate Conference that, as you know, took place in Glasgow, Scotland. Today, we're going to be joined by a legend of the human rights and environmental justice world to talk about what happened at the conference, what it means, and what we need to do next. But first, I missed my xylophone. Let's have some good news, okay? And there is a lot of good news, believe it or not. Nearly 40 countries. Well, first of all, yay. First of all, nearly 40 countries and institutions, including major players like the US, Canada, UK, Germany, and France, announced a new commitment to end international public finance for oil and gas production during COP26 in Glasgow. The annual average potential public finance shifted out of fossil fuels and into clean energy. And this could add to well over $24.1 billion per year, according to our research. So that's really important. Next, some major fossil fuel projects have been successfully defeated this year, in addition to the Keystone XL pipeline. The Jordan Cove liquefied natural gas export terminal in Oregon, the Penn East gas pipeline in New Jersey have both been vanquished. And California announced a ban on fracking and an end to new drilling within 3,200 feet of homes and schools. The tide is turning. But please know, this is important to know, the victories were the result of activism, not the goodwill of the fossil fuel industries or of politicians. It's not going to happen, folks, without us becoming activists. And finally, another piece of good news, after years of pressure from civil society, activists, and the International Energy Agency is more closely aligning its highly influential World Energy Outlook with the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Governments and institutions around the world rely on the IEA for making major decisions on energy investments every year. So this is going to continue to really have a huge impact. Before we introduce our guest today, and I'm so excited that he's going to be our guest, I thought we should spend some time talking about what the hell COP is, C-O-P, COP, and why it matters, okay? In 1992, at the Rio Earth Summit, which I attended, 154 countries signed on to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, often referred to as the UNFCCC, or just the convention, with the ultimate aim of preventing dangerous human interference with the climate system. And it went into force in 1994. Today, it has near universal membership with 197 signatories. And the 197 countries that have ratified the convention are called parties to the convention. Here are some important highlights from the 92 convention. The convention first and foremost recognized the problem The existential threat climate change poses to humanity. This was really remarkable at the time. Borrowing from the Montreal Protocol that is viewed as a shining star of international policy, the convention bound member states to act in the interests of human safety, even in the face of what at that time was kind of scientific uncertainty. The convention set a specific goal to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations at, quote, a level that would prevent dangerous human-induced interference with the climate system, unquote. The convention put the onus on developed countries to lead the way. And given that these countries are the source of most past and current greenhouse gas emissions, industrialized countries were expected to do the most to cut emissions at home, okay? Now, the convention directed funds to climate change activities in developing countries, with industrialized nations agreeing to provide financial support for action on climate change, above and beyond whatever financial assistance they were, already providing those countries. And finally, the convention developed a reporting system to keep tabs on the problem and what's being done about it. Unfortunately, many of the goals of the convention remain unrealized. And pretty shockingly, the UN Climate Treaty, it didn't deal explicitly with fossil fuels at all. They weren't even mentioned, even though we know that carbon pollution from burning oil, gas, and coal is a major driver of the climate crisis. Okay, COP, C-O-P. It stands for the Conference of the Parties. The COP is the supreme decision-making body of the convention. All states that are parties to the convention are represented at the COP. Now, each year, COP assesses the effects of the measures taken by the parties and the progress made in achieving the ultimate objective of the convention. And the first COP meeting was held in Berlin, Germany, in March 1995. 26 years brings us to last month when COP26 was held in Scotland. COP is the main international space where countries come together in an attempt to find common ground to how to reduce carbon pollution, how to adapt to the irreversible changes caused by climate change, and how to move resources, and this is so important, from wealthy countries in the global north to less wealthy and the most brutally impacted countries in the global south so that they can deal with the climate crisis. This year's COP26 had a lot of ups and downs, and we're going to be covering that today. On the bright side, at the end of the Glasgow conference, for the first time in the history of global climate treaties, fossil fuels were actually mentioned in the meeting's final agreement. I mean, it's not everything, but it's a first step in the right direction that deserves to be acknowledged. Ultimately, the deal reached at Glasgow doesn't get us where we need to be to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And the commitments that countries made to cut their climate pollution are not going to keep the planet below 1.5 degrees Celsius in warming. But luckily, leaders at COP agreed to go home and strengthen their plans to cut emissions, which means we need to keep pushing them to make even bigger action, to take action on climate, much, much more. And while following the Paris Climate Conference, participants were only asked to come together again every 5 years, starting with COP26. They've agreed to meet every year, which, given the increasing urgency of the climate crisis, is really good news. It's going to be up to us to make sure that next year's COP sees better results and bolder commitments. During COP, our president, President Biden, openly declared himself a climate leader and declared climate change an existential threat to human existence as we know it. And then he came home and announced the sale of tens of millions of acres to oil and gas leasing. He needs to walk the talk and tell his administration to stop this lease sale. It's total hypocrisy. So let's bring our guest on to help us sort through all of this. I am so excited. For over 40 years, Kumi Naidoo has been a voice amongst many for social, economic, and environmental justice. From his humble township upbringing in KwaZulu Natal, South Africa, to his work as an anti-Apartheid activist, to his leadership of international NGOs, Kumi has remained rooted in Martin Luther King's creative maladjustment principles, and I'm going to ask him to explain that, which means refusing to normalize inequality and devoting himself to exposing injustice. Kumi is recognized internationally as a passionate advocate for human rights, gender equality, economic, social, and environmental justice. In this next chapter of his activism journey, Kumi is dedicating himself to getting back to his roots with a focus on contributing more to the growth of activism movements and organizations, as well as paving the way forward for a new generation of activists. Welcome, Kumi. I've watched so many of your talks and speeches, and I'm just awed by the breadth of your activist experience and your ability to keep fighting, to stay hopeful and inspiring. It's a thrill and an honor to have you as my guest. I wish we had many more hours to talk. Welcome.
Thank you, Jane, for that most generous introduction. Let me just suggest to you, there's another way you could have introduced me, which could be less generous. You could have said, this guy's been around for 40 years fighting the good fight on gender equality, democracy, environmental justice, and actually doesn't have that much to show for it. I say that quite seriously. The moment we find ourselves in really is a moment for honesty, brutal honesty. The decade that we find ourselves in, I believe, is the most consequential decade in the history of humanity. What we achieve in terms of big structural and systemic changes over the next 10 years will determine what kind of future we have, or whether our children and their children will have a future at all. So this is not a moment for playing around, and therefore I love the name of the podcast, because our house is on fire and we need to get our act together. And I just want to start by thanking you, Jane, by taking time to explain what COP means, because one of the weaknesses of the climate movement, insofar as we can call it a movement, is that we don't talk in as accessible ways to the people that need to be part of the struggle. There are far too many people who are spectators in a struggle that they need to be actively engaged in. So talking about degrees and parts per million and drowning people in an alphabet soup of acronyms is not how we mobilize people. We need to start where people's consciousness is. And by the way, I should tell you, when the COP came to my home city in Durban in 2011, I come from a big sort of lower middle class, working class family. Most of my aunts and uncles who are factory workers, they really didn't know what was happening. And when I went to one of my aunt's place and I said, so do you know what's happening? She said, yeah, there's a big police conference taking place, because it said COP, you know. So that's the only association they had with it. So part of the climate challenge we have is we must speak more accessibly to people. You want to know?
Before we go on, I want to take umbrage with one thing you said, that you're old and you've been at it for a long time and have very little to show for it. I'm sorry, I think you're wrong. We are wrong to think that any of this is going to be solved quickly. This struggle is long, it's intersectional, it goes very deep. And the fact that you have been at it for so long, you have no idea the seeds you have sown that have blossomed. You know, I love that expression. They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds. So you, Kumi, with your work, have sprouted
No,
all.
listen, I of course agree. No, Jane, I totally agree with that. Let me just say two things briefly. One, absolutely agree, but the situation that we find ourselves in right now would be significantly worse were it not for the groundswell of activism we've seen over the decades. But I think analytically, right, we have to be brutally honest to acknowledge that we are winning important battles against tremendous odds. I mean, Keystone XL pipeline struggle, when it started, who thought the folks would win, right? The courage that we saw and so on. But when you add it all up, we're winning important battles, but we're losing the overall war for climate justice. And let me just briefly say why I say that. I think most of your listeners probably know that we are already at 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming already, right? And at 1.1, right, we are already seeing such extreme weather events, such massive losses to infrastructure and people's lives and so on. So when I was the head of Greenpeace in 2015, I found myself in the Pacific Island states. And Jane, I learned a new slogan when I was there that up to today, when I hear it, it brings tears in my eyes, where people were chanting, 1.5 to stay alive, 1.5 to stay alive. And by the way, today that slogan has changed. It's not 1.5 to stay alive, it's 1.5 we might survive. 1.5 we might survive. So I suppose when I give that other flip side of it is to say, and I'm influenced by an amazing African anti-colonial leader known as Amilcar Cabral from West Africa, from a small country called Guinea-Bissau, who urged those that stand up and fight for justice to, quote, tell no lies and claim no easy victories. And I think this moment requires us to be honest, but I agree with your qualification on what I said. Thank you so much for that.
So Kumi, obviously, every human being alive right now on this planet is alive at in the last decade of human existence, where we can determine whether we have a future as a species on this planet, right? And so the mindset that we carry at this time is really important. There's never been a time like this in human history. This is not like it used to be. So you're involved with Reverend King's creative maladjustment principles. I'm sure we're going to all have to be creatively maladjusted in the coming years. Would you just very briefly explain what you mean by that so we can be thinking about getting into the right mindset?
Thank you so much. I love answering this question because when I was 4 months old, Martin Luther King gave a speech where he said, "My friends, as I come to the end of my speech, I want to note that in the field of modern child psychology, there's a very dominant term called maladjustment. Now, all of us want to live a well-adjusted life and not suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But my friends, I say to you, there are certain things in our world that are so immoral and unjust that good, decent people should refuse to be well-adjusted to." He then goes on to say, "I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry, racial discrimination, and on the economy," he says, "I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society," unquote. Now, if that was relevant to the United States in 1965, clearly it's 1,000 times more relevant to the US today, and sadly, it's relevant to the whole world. This level of inequality that has built up, because in a way, climate change is a consumption problem, that we're not sharing the resources in the planet on an equitable way. But in a longer version of the speech, he then goes on to say, "I call upon decent women and men to come together and set up a new international organization to be known as the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment." Sadly, that organization was never formed, and perhaps it's not important to set it up. But all of us now must have a mentality when we look at the world, we say, gender inequality on that scale after all the struggle? No, I refuse to accept that. take it, inequality, homelessness, all of these issues. The bottom line is too many good, decent people have adjusted to injustice. And I think what Martin Luther King said to us in the 60s, refused to adjust to injustice. And that's what has informed my life. I mean, I had lots of wonderful people in my history, from, many men and women, from Nelson Mandela to Albertina Sisulu and so on, who, taught us. But Martin Luther King was a big teacher, I think, for people like me and many other people around the world.
Thank you. Kuni, you were recently at the COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, and you've been to many COPs. How many, by the way, have you been to?
Too many is a short answer.
Okay.
My first one was Poznan in 2008 in Poland, when I had not yet joined Greenpeace. I was the chair then of the Global Campaign for Climate Action.
Oh, well, then I've got you beat, because mine was the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. And I remember, I remember there was the official conference off somewhere, attended by all men, mostly white men, all
Absolutely.
men. Whereas activists, scientists, civil society, and everyone else relegated to the People's Forum on the beach in Rio. And I remember so many of us speaking passionately about why it was so critical to have women included and people of color in the official meeting. So in that sense, in the sense that women are very, very much included now, we have made progress. So tell us what actually goes on at COP, both inside that official place and then outside where the activism happens. Why do they matter in the COP? And what's your takeaway from this recent one? And tell the truth.
Okay, so let me just give you my quick take, my one-liner, which is not mine, which I saw somebody on Twitter say. I thought that was great. The assessment of the COP, where it went like this. It's not that COP26 outcomes are good, but could have been better. It's that they are very bad, but could have been much worse, right? So yes, you correctly identified certain important things that moved us forward. And the most important thing that moved us forward was the annual review that you mentioned, which poor climate vulnerable countries organized in a structure called the Climate Vulnerable Forum pushed for. And it's not simply about meeting annually, by the way. It's about coming annually with your targets, right? And saying we need to ramp up ambition every year, because if you take all the commitments made by governments in Glasgow, that guarantees that we're heading to a 2.7 degree world. And that's assuming, by the way, that's assuming every government does everything that they promised, okay? That's just what they committed to do. Whether they implement is another story. But, my first big climate COP was Copenhagen in 2009. And you know what we were calling for then? We were calling for a fab deal. Not a fabulous deal, but a fair, ambitious, and binding deal, fab. Unfortunately, what we got was a flab deal, F-L-A-B, full of loopholes and bullshit, right? It just allowed them to then continue to do. So the one thing that I was want to say, we got to be careful with these COPs about the language they use. And the one thing that I want to pick up on already is, this thing that they are saying, we need to scrap inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, right? So fossil fuel, the old public finance piece that you talked about. But fossil fuel subsidies, your listeners, even though I'm sure are more informed than most, will be shocked to know that according to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, hardly a radical NGO or anything, they noted that last year, from their research, $5.9 trillion went from governments to oil, coal, and gas companies collectively. Now in Glasgow, we failed to get the right language. We wanted them to simply say what they've been pushing them for a long time: we'll scrap fossil fuel subsidies. That taxpayers' money will go to clean energy, not dirty energy. Then you know what they did? They said, yeah. And then last minute, they made sure there was a word that was inserted, as they've done through all the negotiation of the last 10 years. And the word is scrap inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. By just inserting that word inefficient, no definition of what inefficient is, no definition of who will judge whether something, so they can continue to behave as they've always behaved. But what's always inspiring about a COP is what's happening on the outside. On the outside, you're seeing alliance building, folks organizing across boundaries. This time at the COP, I was it's always there, but this time I've seen more of it, which is more artists, cultural workers, people in the arts and culture field coming together to say, we want to be part of the global movement against climate catastrophe on a much larger scale. So you got a weird dynamic, right? On the inside, you got people who are working really hard. By the way, let me just say, the people that are engaged in it are good human beings. They are good there are good human beings that are trapped in I'm not saying all are good, but most of them are well-intentioned, but they are trapped within a system, an economic system and a political system that it's hard to break out to. Let me give you one example. Are you aware which was the largest delegation to the climate negotiations in Glasgow? Now, normally the largest delegation is the host country, right? So UK government had about 250 delegates. But the largest delegation, double that, was the fossil fuel industry with about 503 delegates. Now just think about that for a moment, right? That's like Alcoholics Anonymous having a global annual conference, and the largest delegation to that conference is the alcohol industry. I mean, that's how absurd it is if you break it up. So if the COP didn't exist, Jane, we would have to create it because we would need it to keep the process going. But having said that, it would be unwise for people around the world to continue to place too much of faith in the COP delivering an outcome. We continue to push it in the right direction. But I am convinced now more than ever after this COP, that change will only come from below, right? That yes, people might have been exploited, marginalized, excluded, repressed, oppressed, and so on. But understand that I feel passionately, and I've seen it with my own eyes, notwithstanding all that, people still have agency. People still have creativity. People still have a capability to contribute. And the task of activism today, in my judgment, is creating an enabling environment and multiple pathways by which people can participate. If you are somebody who's in construction work, there must be a way you can contribute to local community building programs. If you're an artist, can you be doing murals, big murals in your community that educates the people and organizes young people and so on? If you're an arts and cultural worker, you have a critical role to play. So bottom line is, we have to break the idea. And if you don't mind, if I can take one issue with one phrase that you used, and that was climate community. I think we are much more than a climate community. We are simply a human community. Climate change is an intersecting issue. Climate change exists because we have a broken economic system, a broken energy system, a broken transport system, and so on. By the way, may I correct myself there and say that many people are now saying, no, Kumi, you're wrong. You shouldn't say that there's a broken economic system and a broken food system and so on, because they say it's not broken at all. It was designed by those that designed it to exclude the majority, so to make sure that a handful of people benefit. Sorry, that was such a long answer to COP, but COP is something I would be happy not to go to in future, but it's a necessary evil until we get on a trajectory that secures the future of current and future generations. We have no choice but to make the COP as best as it can be and to deliver as much as it can deliver, but recognizing that there's a whole range of other energies that need to be brought together, not just relying on the COP on its own.
Right. But one more question about COP. How important is the Beyond Gas and Oil Alliance, or I guess it's Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, that was launched during this COP26 and represents the first ever diplomatic alliance dedicated to keep oil and gas in the ground? This was a massive shift from years past. How important was it, do you think?
I think it was significant, and it was a step in the right direction. I guess obviously you and I would have hoped that they would have done it like 20 years ago, but they need to now pull up the socks and recognize they need to move faster. You know, the difficulty is that, you know, in the COP, it's not like all countries are holding us back in the same way, right? I mean, the small island states in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, least developed countries, they are desperate for climate action. Their lives are being lost of people in their countries now. They're losing infrastructure now. I mean, you take Philippines. Philippines has had one horrendous typhoon after another, taking thousands of lives. And the irony of it, the people that are paying the first and most brutal price of climate impacts are those, sadly, that have contributed least to the problem.
Right.
Many of these people don't even have electricity, you know, don't have modern, you know, fridges and microwaves and so on. So that's why we say that if we are brutally honest, not only do we have climate injustice, and therefore we need climate justice, but we also have a problem of climate apartheid, right? Because if you look at which parts of the world contributed most to the problem and accumulated it, and then you look at which parts of the world that are paying the first and most brutal price in terms of climate impacts, it makes for a very uncomfortable demographic picture. And might I say that if anybody had any doubt that there's climate apartheid, the way the governments of rich countries, against, I believe, or want to believe, against the wishes of their own citizens, the way they've dealt with the vaccines. I mean, it's crazy that Africa, my continent, has only 7.5% of people who are vaccinated. Only 25% of our healthcare workers are vaccinated. So you might think, what's the link between vaccines and climate? They are linked in this way. Both teach us, the pandemic and climate, both teach us that we have to break this divide between North, South, East, West, rich, poor, developed and developing countries. We either get this right as rich and poor nations working together to secure all our children's future. Yes, true, poor countries who contribute least will go down first, but ultimately none of us will be immune from the impacts. And we must remind ourselves that nature does not negotiate. We cannot change the science. All we can do is change political will.
Look how much the economy of the United States depends on the very countries that are being destroyed because of the climate crisis. I mean, it's going to have such a terrible impact on the economies of the rich countries. And we did not commit enough help, did we? We didn't follow through. We being the global north.
Yeah, sadly, in 2009, the rich countries committed to $100 billion a year to help poor countries. By the way, when you say to help poor countries, we must be very clear, it's for mutual benefit.
Right.
Because basically, just as we are saying to the rich countries of the world, please help vaccinate everybody on the world, because if you'll vaccinate yourselves, it's still going to come back to bite you. Africa is becoming a variant factory as a result of that. Right. Similarly, we say, let's work together to address the climate crisis, because otherwise it's going to hit back on you. So I'm encouraged, Jane, by young people in rich and poor countries. They are making connections and solidarity in a way that when I was their age, I didn't even know how to start doing it, right? And I want to hope that the young generation knows for them, they're going to pay the price of our failure, and that they might bring creativity, passion, and energy even more than what they've already done.
Kumi, so what's next? COP is done, COP26. The next one is in a year. Scientists say that we have to reduce emissions 50% in 8 years. What should we do if our governments are clearly not having the courage to act in line with science? Do you think it's time for more direct action, more civil disobedience? What should we do? I mean, it's just so horrifying to see what President Biden said in Glasgow and then what he did and is doing now that he's back home. What do we do?
Okay, some of your listeners will be disappointed in my answer to this question, right? Because it might sound very soft in the sense, but I think this moment actually must call for compassion and for putting ourselves in each other's shoes, right? I've never met President Biden. I want to believe, and I actually do believe, that deep in his heart, he's a good human being that wants to do the right thing. When he speaks, you can see that it's, I don't want to quote any other presidents of the United States where it's so obvious that they are lying and are not speaking the truth. They've had enough airtime. I'd rather not mention them by name, but with him, you can see there's a genuine seriousness about it, right? Mm-hmm. But the problem is, he's got a whole administration behind him, because the excuse that we're giving us in Glasgow is that the previous administration had signed certain contracts with the relevant companies and so on, right? So what I want to say is that no question, he needs to be better. But this moment is also a moment where we need two things that are contradictory, that might appear to be contradictory, but the size of the world should allow both to happen. On the one effort, history teaches us when those in power were resistant to make changes for justice, whether on gender equality, civil rights in the United States, apartheid in South Africa, and many other struggles, from slavery to colonialism and beyond. Those struggles only move forward when decent women and men stood up and said, enough is enough and no more. We're prepared to go to prison if necessary. We're prepared to even put our lives on the line if necessary, right? And so I think that moral pressure, right, when people show, like you and others have done, that, listen, we're prepared to take some inconvenience because the stakes are high. Now, I think that needs to intensify and grow. However, there's a real danger about how we deal with our anger and disappointment of those in power, right? And those that have betrayed us systemically and systematically for so long. I think it's very important that especially young people, and I say this to young people whenever I engage with them, I say, I understand your anger, I understand your disappointment, I understand your frustration, but please don't give a gift to the right-wing forces in the world by being tempted to engage in violence, because that's exactly what they want us to do right now. They will come after anything. They're already doing it against peaceful demonstrations around the world. And bear in mind, in many countries, the fossil fuel companies own our governments, not the other way around, right? You can make your own judgment about the United States, but understand that the war in Iraq was going to be called Operation Iraqi Liberation, and they changed it last minute to be called Operation Iraqi Freedom, because they figured out Operation Iraqi Liberation spelled OIL. And they thought that might be a bit too obvious. So I think we need to recognize that there are people in state governments, city governments, federal government, all over the place that are on our side. We have to find those individuals, support them, nurture them, help grow them, and so on, you know, within what they're trying to do internally. But there's something else we need to do. And then now, I'm sure many of your listeners will get upset with what I'm going to say now. And that is, activism has to be about winning over the people that don't agree with us. It's not simply about organizing the people that already agree with us, creating an echo chamber, talking to ourselves, getting more and more passionate and more committed, and us being 10% of the population in a particular space. And I think in the United States, and you should know that people around the world are desperately concerned about what's happening in the United States. When we look at the United States, we see a country that's in a virtual civil war, right? In terms of a woman's right to choose, in terms of climate, in terms of, I mean, you got two parallel realities. I mean, the United States is the only country in the world that I know where it is so legitimized that not only you have the right to your own opinions, in the United States, you seem to have the right to your own facts in terms of, you know, the parallel universe with Fox and other right-wing folks and so on. So I think what we need to do is broaden the base of participation, meaning we must stop this idea about there's something called the climate community or something called the climate movement or a climate activist. Basically, all of us need to join this fight. I'll tell you a personal story quickly, right? My eldest sister, her name was Kay, and she was tragically diagnosed with brain cancer in December 2017, and she was gone a month and a few days later. And at a funeral, I was so upset with this priest. He decided, when he introduced me, make a big thing about like what I had done and so on, you know, in my life. And I was like really super irritated. And when I spoke, I had to respond to that. I said, you know what? Most people won't consider my sister as an activist, right? They consider me and my younger brother as an activist and my brother as activist because we were in the public, right? But my brother and my brother spent more time in prison and so on than I did. But my brother and I would be the first to say, as we said at a funeral, that we would not have been able to contribute if it wasn't for a quiet solidarity, organizing us, places to hide when the police were looking at, the apartheid police were searching us, organizing us money to print a pamphlet or take a bus to go to a rally, also taking a husband's keys and putting it on the ledge and telling us, come at 2 o'clock in the morning, take it, go spray the Free the Mandela slogans, and then come make sure you put it back at 4 o'clock back on the windowsill and so on. You know, I tell the story because we have to recognize that people can contribute in different ways. And there is a real imperative that we de-intellectualize activism, that we de-professionalize activism, where like we create this thing, you know, you only can be an activist, you working full-time for some outfit or the other. And the most important thing is we got to do this with fun, right? We cannot give the Bolsonaros and the Modis and the Trumps of the world the benefit to know that they've taken us away from a family because we have to fight so hard to get them to come to terms with reality. But we can't also give them the privilege of saying, well, actually, you completely made us upset and miserable. No, when I was Secretary General of Amnesty, we gave Fridays for the Future and Greta Thunberg and colleagues the highest award at Amnesty called the Ambassador of Conscience Award, right? And when I was handing it over, I said, please, if there's one thing you must do, you're gonna sing, you're gonna dance, you're gonna laugh, you're gonna waltz your way through this, because that is critically important for our own spirit. And so sometimes people, you know, I tell lots of bad jokes and people say, oh, Kumi, you still have your bad jokes, aren't you? And I say, listen, we gotta laugh and smile and dance through this hardship. And we gotta just remind ourselves that what is activism? Activism is simply, in my judgment, an act of love. It is about saying we refuse to accept that the world we live in is the best that humanity can create for itself. And with the climate reality pounded on all the other systemic racism, inequality, and so on, I believe we've got no choice but to embrace that with full urgency, which is what I believe we need right now.
I'm going to tell you a little story now, Kumi, that really illustrates what you're saying. By the early 1970s in the United States, the anti-war movement here was on its last breath. Nixon had convinced so many Americans that the war was ending because he was bringing ground troops home, and they didn't realize that he was escalating the air war. because the ground troops were coming home. So they thought the war was ending. He was telling them the war was ending. That's number one. Number two, the anti-war movement before then in the 60s had become violent protests. And people were really, middle America was really turned off by that. And so it was on its last legs, the anti-war movement. A delegation of young American students went to Vietnam in 1970. And you know what the Vietnamese leadership said to them? Become Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. Disappear into the population and blend in with the people like Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. And I was married at the time to a wonderful activist, a very important person in the American movement, Tom Hayden. And I was wondering, because I was a real novice at the time, when the delegation came back, Tom was right there. What did they say? What did they say? What did they say? Because he knew that a message was going to be sent. And I thought, what does he care what the Vietnamese had to say? When he heard become Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, we all cut our hair. People bought suits and ties. And we went across the United States, the Indochina Peace Campaign. And we had singers with us, Holly Near and others. And yes, and it was joyful. And for months and months, one year after another, we traveled the country and began to rally new people to the cause, partly because we were having fun, partly because we were talking in a way that they could understand, and we weren't scaring them.
Yeah.
Well,
and I think that
we succeeded in the most important thing, to cut the funding of the war. And shortly after the war ended, you don't see this in history books. You don't see this in Ken Burns' documentary about Vietnam. But that's the truth, and I know that you, Kumi, will understand that. Isn't that wonderful?
That's wonderful. I mean, that's exactly the right message for this moment, actually. Right at this moment, okay, I'm going to say it. We need to learn to love the people that voted for Donald Trump. I'm not saying we need to learn to love Donald Trump. We need to find ways to recognize the humanity of the people that were misled, misdirected, lied to, and continue to be lied to right now. Yeah. Right? We cannot dismiss them as the enemy. We have to we need to disappear into the population and we need to go and have conversations with those folks, right? Because let's be blunt about it, much as we all want to deny it, at the end of the day, these folks are our brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers, and it's not as if like there's this strange creature that's hiding somewhere called a right-wing Trump voter, right? And it's not as if people just woke up one day and were right-wing Trump voters, right? They've been lied to, they've been betrayed, they've been, and we're never going to win back everybody. But the realities of the arithmetic of American political life, right? Even if you didn't have a sense of compassion and so on, like I'm advocating, but even if you were cold and hard, if you looked at the arithmetic of the reality of electoral politics in the US, you have no choice but to figure out how to win those people over. And for the climate struggle, I think the climate struggle offers progressive politics in the United States a chance to win back some of the folks who have been lied to, but that will never happen if people don't start talking to each other. So when you ask me, what do we do? Yes, civil disobedience that's respectful of how you, like, for example, I'm beginning to wonder whether it's appropriate to do a civil disobedience action that impacts on working class people trying to get to work, for example, right? Working class people who are struggling just to pay their bills and they're not on our side, and suddenly they see us as climate activists. By the way, I've done all of this, so everything, if there's any criticism, it's a self-criticism, right? But I'm at this moment of saying, as Albert Einstein once said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. And if I'm brutally honest, I can put up my hand and say I meet that definition of insanity. Might have done it in good faith, but we are at a point where we must be willing to experiment, try new things, not be dogmatic.
Be humble.
And build bridges of dialogue and communication with those that are not with us. Activism cannot be simply about consolidating those people who agree with us. It has to be winning those that don't agree with us at the moment.
Yeah. I love something you said that I heard. The most important contribution we can make is to not give up.
You know, I had a close friend of mine, and I was thinking you're reminding me of him in a way. When I tell you the story, you'll know why. So when both of us were 22 years old, we were fleeing the country into exile in different directions. And he asked me, so Kumi, what is the biggest contribution you can make to the cause of humanity? I said, giving your life. And he said, you mean going, getting shot and killed and becoming a martyr and so on? I said, I guess so. Because it was happening every week in South Africa at that time. Every other weekend, we were burying friends and colleagues who had been murdered by the regime. So he said, no, Kumi, it's not giving your life. It's giving the rest of your life. I was 22 years old that time. My friend Lenny was way ahead of us. He was like the only person who understood the intersection between environmental justice and racial justice. We didn't know what he was talking about. I jokingly say at that time, he was probably less than 2,000 voluntary vegetarians on the entire African continent, right? He was ahead of some. He got the climate stuff and so on. And then anyway, to cut a long story short, he was murdered brutally by the regime 2 years later. There were so many bullets in his body. Parents couldn't even recognize him and the 3 young women that he was murdered with. And so I had to think deeply about giving your life versus giving the rest of your life, right? What he was saying is that the struggle for justice is a marathon. It's not a sprint, right? And those of us that have had the benefit of education, knowledge, skill, and so on, we have the biggest responsibility we can do. If you can sing, that's a skill. If you can dance, that's a skill. If you can write, that's a skill. If you can build things, all of these skills are needed for the struggle to prevent climate catastrophe. And so what she was saying is, the biggest contribution we can make is stay true to those struggles for the rest of your life, right? That's the biggest contribution you can make. The struggle for justice is a marathon, not a sprint. And why I was so happy when you reached out for this conversation is, in your own way, you live that spirit, right? That the struggle is a marathon. I'm not going to mention your name, your age, sorry, but you're right there and you're still going. And that for me, and for many people around the world, including at least 2 of my aunts, is a major inspiration, because 2 of my aunts are very excited that I'm having a chat with you today.
Well, you do know, Kumi, that older women get more radical and braver.
That's wonderful. I'm looking forward to seeing more of it.
I wish I could talk to you for hours more, Kumi, and maybe that time will come at some point. I hope I will meet you in person someday. Where are you, by the way?
I'm normally in South Africa. I'm currently on a fellowship in Berlin, where I am actually doing 2 pieces of work, 2 podcasts, Power, People, and Planet, where I'm trying to ask the question, why is activism not winning fast enough and big enough? And what do we need to change to win on the scale that the climate crisis requires? And one of my answers to the question of why we're not winning is that we need to communicate better with people. And so I'm doing a piece of work with an amazing artist who was just talking to when you called, actually, Olafur Eliasson, who's here in Berlin, trying to look at how we bring the worlds of arts and culture and the world of activism into a more dynamic, powerful relationship, which is mutually respectful and beneficial. Lots is happening already, by the way. It's not like we're starting anything. There's
Right.
tons of happening. We're just trying to lift up and elevate, because I believe that we in the activist community should humble ourselves, listen and learn on how it is that we get the messaging right and not project our consciousness on the people that we need to bring along with us, but to humble ourselves, understand where people are, and exactly what you all were told a long time ago, disappear amongst the people and work with the people. And that's what we need to do much, much more of, not just in the United States, but everywhere around the world. And we're going to have fun while we do it as well.
Well, please, I want to be sure that I know how to find out what you're doing, especially around the arts. Thank you so much for joining us, Kumi, and sharing your insights. We have to come together as a global community to address the climate crisis. Global community, not climate community.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Good luck with all that you're doing. I'm so impressed with the energy. If I make it to your age and if I have half the energy that you have right now, I will be orgasmic. I would be really happy.
How old are you?
I'm 56.
56. Oh boy.
Yeah, I'm a baby.
Yeah, I'll be 84 next week, and I'm much happier than I was and stronger than I was at 56. So.
Wow, wonderful! I look forward to being in the same space. Hopefully, if I make it.
So. You're truly an inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hard to believe we're at the end of the show and end of the year almost. And how about we take a look now and look back at some of the other incredible guests that we've had join us in 2021. Let's do that, okay? Welcome to all you fire drill firefighters. Hello to my stalwart regulars. Welcome to our first Friday of the month rally. I'm wearing my rally hat. We are about inspiring action to end the fossil fuel era through storytelling, building community, and a little sass. We all want and we need meaning in our lives. I was just a little older than you when I became an activist, and it gave me purpose. What do you feel your purpose is, and what do you see for yourself in the future?
I do see my purpose as someone that unapologetically says it like it is and hopefully makes the maximum amount of change that I possibly can during my time here on Earth. Because my purpose isn't to bask in the glory of what I've created for myself. It's to use what I've created for myself as a platform to launch way more important messages.
There were many times in my life where, what I was doing didn't seem to make sense, but I kept at it because I believed in justice. So I'm now here for this moment. All the work I did up until now has prepared me to lead the federal government on issues of equity in the energy system. And it wasn't guaranteed that that would be the case, but I kept at it. And now I know why I have struggled for so long to make it to this point, because I was born for it. And so you were born to do your own unique thing in the world, and you have gifts to give. So keep at it and just believe that there is a greater purpose for you on this earth.
Women and girls are in the leadership of the climate movement. I know it with Fire Drill Fridays, 2/3 of our audience, this was true both in DC and now online, are female. We take the brunt of the climate crisis, and we're on the front lines of the solution.
And so what we're focused on is making sure that Black folks understand what's happening to them. We're also focusing in on how we connect with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, our Latino brothers and sisters, to say, if the brown folk get together on this and stand up for the value and the soul of this nation, we can win this thing. And it's not just about shaming. It's about coming up with creative and new ideas that are rooted in the traditions that have survived. And that are the traditions of Africa, the traditions of Turtle Island, and that's what we need to be uplifting. This is about us building power. Power from a love place, not from fear. Power from love, yeah.
Such a win-win. God, I love how you articulated, Colette. Thank you.
All of us should do what we can in our daily lives, but we should recognize that the fossil fuel industry's fixation on individual action is a distraction from the really big changes that we have to make.
What these big oil and gas companies have been doing for years, they refuse to put people over profits, and so we have to do that.
The oil industry is on this precipice, and it is really up to the actions of people listening to decide what is that fate ultimately going to be.
We have to move and have really a systems change about how we source our energy.
This is the time that you can be so creative with green innovation, green economy, that we can look and we can truly make a difference, and you can be the change we are waiting for.
The science is pretty clear. If we don't act, we're going to leave a planet that is not as sustainable or inhabitable for my kids and for their kids.
When something is inherently dangerous, we have an obligation to protect our children from harm.
With this urgent crisis that's in front of us, we have to respond with urgency.
I come from protests, and when we are out there on those streets, I'm on that bullhorn, and I'm often asking people, what do I bring to this movement to move us all closer to justice?
Each of us must look in the mirror and say, if I want the world to change, how must I change myself?
We need you in this for the long haul. This is a marathon.
And people talk about, let's go back to normal.
Yeah, normal was the problem.
Normal. Jane, can I just use one word for profanity here?
Yeah, sure.
Let's not go back to the effed up way it was.
We didn't get here by just accident. It's been very intentional for a very long time, because the people who are on the front lines oftentimes of regeneration and sustainability that aren't necessarily using that language, but are just the proper stewards of the land, have been Black and Indigenous people.
And so there is a racial justice aspect of the need to defeat climate change.
If you believe in something, speak up. That is, to me, being supportive and being a good ally. Speak up and speak out.
We need all of you to join us in this struggle and support Black, Brown, Indigenous networks and organizations. But we ask that you show up in a good way, with good heart and good action. Be truthful, be vulnerable, and be joyful.
If we want to choose this vision of a multiracial, inclusive democracy, we have to fight like hell for it.
That is why it is so important that we recognize the power that we have.
But it's going to take boldness, and it's going to take some bravery and courage.
Don't ever let anyone dim your light, and don't let anyone try to quiet your voice.
You were born for this moment. There's a reason why you're here.
What a great reminder of how many of our leaders are out there every single day fighting for justice and the climate, and we need to keep taking action. In Glasgow, Scotland, at COP26, the Biden team said that subsidizing fossil fuels goes against common sense, and they made a pledge to cut funding for oil, gas, and coal projects abroad. But at home, they seem to have given up on pushing Congress to remove billions of dollars of giveaways to oil and gas CEOs in the Build Back Better Act. It's not in there anymore. Additionally, the U.S. continues to be hell-bent on pushing what they call market-based solutions to climate change, like carbon offsetting. These scams, make no mistake, they let companies continue to pollute as long as they pay someone else to put their carbon pollution or plant a tree. Somebody else has to cut their carbon pollution. It's a scam. They've been proven not to work. It's a way that fossil fuel CEOs can greenwash their dirty energy with the government's help and keep emitting. So don't fall for that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, shortly after last month's COP, the Biden administration announced the largest federal lease sale of public waters for oil drilling. This is a sharp departure from the president's own words during COP. But we need to keep pushing Biden if we want him to be a real climate leader. We need to listen to scientists and take immediate action to address the climate crisis. That means phasing out fossil fuels once and for all and not supporting further oil and gas drilling leases and subsidies. This lease sale includes over 80 million acres in the Gulf of Mexico. That same region that was devastated by the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the Gulf has still not recovered from that. And the Gulf has since experienced continuous spills and leaks as hurricanes have become more frequent and more powerful due to the climate crisis. These communities are also subject to the persistent pollution that comes from oil infrastructure. And you know the drill, firefighters. To make change, we need to take action. So one more time before the new year, please go to firedrillfridays.com/takeaction and tell President Biden and Secretary of the Interior, Deborah Haaland, that they must stop the sale now. They know what's right, and now we have to make them do it. To close our show today, we're going to take a look ahead and hear from some of the incredible folks at Greenpeace and Fire Drill Fridays, what we can expect at the turn of the year and what gives them hope. Let's look at the end of year video.
In 2022,
you can look forward to another year of Greenpeace fighting for ambitious legislation.
With our supporters, allies in the Breakthrough from Plastic movement, we will ensure that companies take serious steps to reduce our plastic use.
2022 is a critical midterm election year.
We're going to hold the Biden administration accountable for its continued support for the fossil fuel industry.
We have an opportunity to stop deep sea mining before it starts. And 2022 is going to be a key year for it.
I'm looking forward to working with movement allies to protect and expand voting rights.
We will also demand a strong global plastic treaty
that addresses the full life cycle of plastic, not just the plastic that pollutes our beaches and waterways.
A lot is coming together to make 2022 an amazing year.
In the coming year, we will channel our collective power and creative direct action.
So we can ratchet up our campaign by engaging our supporters and volunteers to directly go after bad corporate actors.
And we're going to focus on stopping oil and gas expansion. And this includes
working alongside even more activists who are leading on environmental and social justice.
What gives me hope?
I'm hopeful because I'm inspired every day by the courage and resilience of community members who use their hearts, their voices, and their feet
to build a just, equitable, and sustainable environment for us all.
One reason that I'm very hopeful right now is that
all of the people who have taken action for the first time in the pandemic, or those who found ways to continue doing so despite the pandemic.
I am inspired by my colleagues and people across the movement
that is emboldened and uncompromising in our fight to secure a livable future for themselves and generations yet to come.
And what gives me so much hope is
people like you who will help bring California and the rest of the country into a future beyond fossil fuels.
People are fed up with greedy corporations and corrupt politicians, and they're ready to fight for their future and our planet.
By continuing to apply pressure to the worst polluters, we're making a future free from polluting plastics and fossil fuels inevitable.
What gives me hope is a diverse, youth-led movement.
Getting to talk with super passionate, motivated, and radical young people is what gives me hope.
The problems that we're facing today are global in scope, and it takes a global organization like Greenpeace to take them on.
I am determined to keep going and to win.
Because I know that in the new year, we're going to be doing a whole lot more.
I am so proud to be part of such a fabulous change-making community that includes all you. It's what keeps me hopeful. At Fire Drill Fridays, we're strategizing exactly what 2022 will look like from an activism viewpoint. It's going to be a very critical year. But one thing you can be absolutely sure of, we'll be fighting like hell to end the era of fossil fuels. And I hope that you'll all be with me. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being on this journey. We've built a beautiful and powerful community, and I deeply, deeply hope and pray it's going to grow every day. We have to keep it growing. Please take care of yourselves over the holidays and in the new year, but also take time to rest, to reflect, and rejoice in all the beauty that surrounds us, and get ready for a lot of ruckus in 2022. See you next time.